In a recent interview with Vox, American political consultant James Carville went off on wokeness and the Democratic Party, saying, quote, "Wokeness is a problem and everyone knows it. It's hard to talk to anybody today, and I talk to lots of people in the Democratic Party who doesn't say this, but they don't want to say it out loud."
Democratic strategist Colin Rogero and co-host of the Real Man podcast, Marshall Kossoff, they join us now to discuss. Colin, let me start with you. There's actually an element of this. The wokeness part got a lot of attention, but what I was more fascinated by, I've heard you say similar things, is that James Carville almost has this admiring view of Fox News and the Republican machine, and he wants much more of it. So he's like, why don't we tie these Republicans to Dennis Hastert, who is a pedophile?
Such a weird
idea. Like,
if
it was
no
the
one
opposite.
Remembers who he is.
I don't know, though. He was like, if it was a Republican, you'd see that shit. I can curse here or whatever. It says you see that shit on Fox News every day back in 2016. I'm like, he's not wrong in terms of how many Hillary segments and more. Generally, what did you make of this entire interview? I found it fascinating.
Yeah, look, I think it was fascinating, and I agree and disagree with James in a couple of ways. I think there's I think he's conflating wokeness and being a little bit of a snowflake in the Democratic Party in the same way, and forgetting the Democratic Party at its core is an opposition party. And if you're in opposition, you got to be tough, and let me curse back at you and say you got to be able to kick some ass, and you got to be unafraid to do that. And sometimes that means you got to hurt people's feelings along the way. So I agree with him in that regard. I think quote unquote wokeness, if we're talking about language, I don't necessarily agree with, because in some ways, look, your language has to change as viewpoints change. And that's a good thing, right? When we're talking about certain groups of people, when we're talking about a new way of looking at society, we got to change the language along with that. I happen to vehemently agree with him about Latinx, because as a Hispanic person, as a Latino, I can't use that, Dame la llave del carrex, like it doesn't work, right? Or no funcionex, pardon me, right? Like just bad, and I would love to see them do that to French or Italian people, right? Like they don't go. So I agree with some of this stuff. I just think people have to be a little bit more practical, and they've got to be a little bit less about being offended all the time, getting their feelings hurt. I'm with that, but I don't necessarily identify with the super liberal portion of the party that gets angry about everything. Although I do happen to be pretty damn liberal.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing is Carville talks about the faculty lounge speak. And I think to Colin's point, there's nothing wrong with moving language forward and learning that, that terminology, the way we used to talk about that, we should leave that in the past and we should move forward. I think the problem comes in when you don't want to bring people along. Instead, you want to judge them for not already being there. And that's what he speaks to, is this sense of contempt and condescension that comes from the party towards a lot of parts of the country. The other piece of this, and there were parts of it that I disagreed with as well, like the Denny Hastert thing, or his other big idea was we should tie the Republicans to the insurrection every single day. I also don't agree with that strategy. So there were some pieces here that I did not like. I do agree generally with the idea that there should be a little bit more effective, simple messaging in the Democratic Party that would go a long way. Certainly, we've always been envious of the conservative media ecosystem and how they can take one story and blow it up for weeks and weeks and weeks. But Marshall, this part I profoundly agree with and I think is really interesting. He says, look at Florida. You now have Democrats saying Florida is a lost cause. Really? In 2018 in Florida, giving felons the right to vote got 64%. In 2020, a $15 minimum wage, which we have no chance of passing federally, got 67%. Has anyone in the Democratic Party said maybe there's nothing wrong with the state of Florida? Maybe the problem is the kind of campaigns that we are running. And Marshall, I'll put that to you, but I also want to hear Colin's thoughts on this since he's the Florida guy.
Yeah, Colin, please go first. Teach me about Florida.
Here's what I would say. That's absolutely right. He is right about the style of campaigns we're running in Florida. There's an application of DC think that you run Florida in the way that you run other states, and it's not actually like that. Florida's almost 7 different little countries broken up, and you have to approach each area in a different way. I've talked about this ad nauseum. We've talked about it on the show. And look, I think one of the biggest misses in Florida has consistently been the fact that the Latino vote is not well paid attention to, and communication does not happen with Latino audience until late, and it's done so in a way and by people who do not understand who they're talking to. There has to be some cultural relevance there. Because let me tell you something, if you want to win a statewide race in Florida, and we can talk about the congressional districts later, you have to have black and brown turnout through the roof from West Palm Beach south. You got to turn out the Puerto Rican audience that is not conservative in Orlando, and you got to not lose majority of the white women in the suburbs in Tampa. It's not that complicated, but people are still running these I-4 corridor type campaigns thinking that's where the swing vote is, and it's not. And so hopefully in the future, they will give people who understand how to win these states a bigger chance and a bigger say. And look, I would be surprised. I think there's going to be a good race down there on the Senate side this year. The gubernatorial race is another story. We'll see how that all shakes out when we have candidates. But the Senate race, I think, could be more competitive than people assume, even though Marco Rubio is been around forever and is historically difficult to beat.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, Marshall, let me go ahead on Florida. I have another thing I want you to react to. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the immediate thought here, I'm glad I'm going after Colin on this, is basically just that, one, it seems clear to me that Florida, if you're looking at those ballot initiatives, look, this is a nationalization of politics issue. I think that if you look at issues like the voting laws and the criminal prison laws, I think those things are things that people are looking at, like just, hey, do I like this policy or do I not like that policy? They're not putting that into any broad framework of politics. But look, I think I would probably say that for the next few years, Florida probably is a lost cause for Democrats because, once again, at a national level, when you're looking at those congressional races, when you're looking at those senatorial races especially, they're going to be read through the lens of national politics. And I think through that lens of national politics is a red state. And when you're able to look at issues case by case, and you're able to frame them as this is about Florida, this isn't about what's happening in Washington, D.C., I think that's why you're seeing those ballot initiatives pass. And I'm just unclear. It's just unclear to me how, if you're a Democratic candidate, you're going to be able to frame yourself in that just in Florida context, given the fact that you have like a really strong Republican bench in the state, and given the fact that they're going to pivot things towards the national on that level.
Yeah, well, I think the bigger point that he's making here, and by the way, let me just say, I have all sorts of issues with James Carville, who said that, giving health
Michael
insurance
Bennett's
to
fan.
everyone it was Michael Bennett. He said that was naive to give people health care, et cetera, et cetera. But on this point, what's interesting to me is he's saying, look, basically, if you've got the policies of the Democratic Party polling in the 60s, but the Democratic Party itself, hopelessly lost, that's not a policy issue. That's a Democratic Party issue. And he attributes that to this sense of basically contempt and condescension. He calls it faculty lounge bullshit, he says, is a big part of that. And I don't think he's wrong about that.
No, I think he is right. And he had this line, Colin, let me read it to you. It's like, he's like, we came within 40,000 votes of being a world. We won the White House against a, quote, world historical buffoon. And we came within 42,000 votes of losing. We lost congressional seats. We didn't pick up state legislatures. So now let's have an argument of whether we're off key or messaging. We're off because there's too much jargon. There's too much esoterica and it turns people off. But I thought his more interesting point was actually down here. I had it highlighted, which is that you're never going to win working class whites, he says. But the difference between losing by 80-20 and 72-8 is all the difference in the world. What did you make of that comment in particular?
I absolutely agree, and the Republicans know this both in the working white class communities and they know it in Latino and black communities. That's why they're doing an increased amount of outreach there. They know they're not going to win the black and brown vote, but they know they've only got to move it 2 to 3 points, and they put us in a really difficult position to win. So I agree with them 100%. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier in the segment and some of what Donald Trump's strength was, right? You're boiling complicated issues down into something that people can understand and in language that people actually use. That jargonistic nonsense, I mean, look, I have a lot of respect for my friends in polling. I work with them daily, but I also have a hell of a lot of arguments with them about how they're framing questions because it's just not how people talk. I mean, good Lord, if I got to hear somebody else say quality, affordable health care again, as if people actually even know what that means, or it's actually a powerful statement, I'm going to throw up. But, we've got to talk to people where they are. And that's been historically the Democrats' problem. We're a big tent party, so by nature, it's a little bit more difficult. But somebody's got to be out there leading the messaging, saying, this is what we are saying, and this is how we are saying it. And then we follow what Republicans do. They're really good at it. They say the same thing over and over again until it becomes truth. And we should be following that model. Why we're not all out there saying, look, 200 million shots and 150 million checks delivered, and saying that ad nauseum until people are repeating it as they walk down the street, regardless of party. We should be doing that. These are huge accomplishments in 100 days that are not only the result of the administration, but the Congress can take advantage of some too. And we should be. We're not, but we should.
Great points, guys. Really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, gents.
Thanks, all.
Thanks.
More Rising for you after this.